Hello and welcome to Essex by the Sea. I'm Owen Ward, exploring the Essex coast, finding out about the amazing and interesting stories it has to offer. Now, for today's episode, I'm in Harwich, the historic harbour town, port town, that dates back many, many years. And I'm here to find out about a voyage that set off from Harwich over 400 years ago. David Whittle joins me here in the Harwich Museum. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Now, to start with, people may have heard about the Mayflower. Just briefly, if you can, explain what the Mayflower is, and we'll dive into more about it.
The Mayflower is very, very big in America, but the story starts in this country. There was people who could not agree with the religion, and a lot of these people lived in Lincolnshire, and they moved across to Amsterdam and then to Leiden, and the same thing happened here. People wanted to be free to carry out their own type of religion, and so the pilgrims got together. There was the Mayflower, which was a Harwich ship. We don't know where the Mayflower was built, but he was certainly registered in Harwich, and the captain was Christopher Jones. Now, Christopher Jones, we cannot prove where he was born, but he certainly got married twice in Harwich Church. The first time was in 1593, and he married a young lady called Sarah Twitt. She was only 17 years old. They had one son, which unfortunately died, and Sarah herself did die when she was 27. But being said, we have the records from the parish. Not to be too downhearted, Christopher found quite a rich widow called Josian Gray, and she was part of a very famous Gray family. John and Thomas Gray, for instance, they were captains of ships that took place in the Armada in 1588. But to go back to the Mayflower, Christopher Jones actually moved away from Harwich in 1611, and he moved to Rotherhithe in the south bank of the Thames. And this is where the voyage started out. You had the Speedwell, which was the ship that came from Holland, bringing the Dutch pilgrims. And you've got the Mayflower. They both met at Southampton, and both set off for the New World. But just into the Atlantic, they decided there was problems with the Speedwell, and they turned back and went into Dartmouth. And there it was decided that the Speedwell wasn't seaworthy, and therefore they put as many people on the Mayflower as they possibly could. And the last place it left from was Plymouth, from the steps there. And that is why the first landing in America is now named Plymouth Rock.
And of course they sailed across the Atlantic, and there's a very large map here in the Harwich Museum that shows that route around the south coast of Britain and then across the Atlantic to America. And it really was the start of America as we know it today, wasn't it?
Yes, but let's go back in Harwich history to 1607, just to diversify. There was a man called Christopher Newport. Now, he was born in Harwich, and he was the admiral of the fleet of 3 ships that founded Jamestown in 1607, and that was the first English-speaking colony in America. And then the Pilgrims came 13 years later. So, yeah, Harwich was really in before the Mayflower.
So, we've got lots of people from Harwich and surrounding places, because one thing that you've just shown me here at the museum, there is interactive screens which tells you a wealth of information about the Mayflower and its voyage across the Atlantic. And what I quite like about them is it tells you the stories of the people who were on it and where they were from, and they're all over the place, aren't they?
That's right. And so there are 2 screens. You can hear about Harwich in the 1600s. You can hear about various aspects within Harwich, and the screen goes on. It's a touch screen. You just touch it, go backwards and forwards, and the other screen gives the list of the crew, the passengers and the pilgrims, and it's all interactive. You choose a name, press on the name, it gives you the history of the person, and a little red light lights up on the map of England to say where they came from.
So what was Harwich like then, back in the 1600s?
It's not that much different today. The street grid system is still the same. The larger roads sort of go north to south, and the very small lanes that go east to west are even offset from each other, because when we get a cold northeast wind here, by having the roads offset from each other, it's sort of kept the wind out of the town. But it's still the original grid pattern, and some of the houses are over 500 years old. Some have been replaced with modern blocks of flats, but people need somewhere to live. But we still have a lot of houses, nearly 200 Grade 2 listed buildings and one Grade 1 building in town.
And what is nice, after visiting the Harwich Museum, finding out about these people, is actually then to go and wander around the town, because the buildings predominantly are still there. You can see where they lived.
Yeah, we can. Christopher Jones' house still exists in King's Head Street. And the pub opposite, called the Elmer, that was where Sarah Twitt lived. And her father was a rich merchant when it wasn't a pub in those days, but it dates back to then. And probably the oldest house in Harwich is Forrester's, which belongs to the Harwich Society, which dates back to 1450.
Back to the Mayflower then, what would life have been like on that ship? You said obviously a lot of people were transferred from the other vessel onto the Mayflower. It must have been quite uncomfortable?
I would think it would have been pretty grim. They set off a lot later than they thought, because it was October time. They were crossing the Atlantic, and there was one drama on the way across, because one of the main beams cracked in the ship. But on board the ship, the Pilgrims had a jack, and they had some pretty heavy timbers. So in the middle of an Atlantic gale, everyone turned to and jacked this piece of wood and shored up the broken beam. So today we'll get on an aeroplane, won't we? We'll be there in 6 hours. But they didn't have the guarantee that they'd even arrive, because, it's what it was. It was a small ship. It was only 90 feet long.
I was going to say, I've seen a replica of the Mayflower, and it is a very small vessel.
It is. If the replica, well, there's one in America, actually, Mayflower 2, and I think it's built to score, only 90 feet long. That's nothing. And then you look at our liners of today, and then sails only. It was quite a feat of seamanship by Jones to get it across there in the first place, especially with all the dramas. And lots of extra people. It must have been very, very difficult.
One other person you showed me just before we started chatting was someone that was very important on the ship and was from Harwich.
Yes.
And when you first said what they did, I thought, OK, they make barrels. But actually, barrels are very important on ships.
Yeah. His name was John Alden. He came from Harwich. He was a Harwich man, and he was a cooper. And a cooper makes barrels. Everything you can think of on a barrel, whether it's the beer, and of course beer keeps better than water, it doesn't go stagnant. A good excuse to drink beer, but there we go. Everything you can think about, flour, meat, is all in barrels. So he must have been a very, very important man on the ship, because the cooper would have been constantly checking the stores to make sure the barrels weren't leaking and everything was in good order as far as the food.
It's a fascinating town with so many connections, of course, to the town of Harwich. What impact did that voyage have for the world and also, of course, for America?
Yeah, very much. There are several million descendants from the Mayflower. When they arrived in America, it was winter. And Christopher Jones stayed over the winter period so the people could stay on board in, relative comfort of the ship rather than being in the open, and then they went ashore in the spring. But while they were on board, they formed the Mayflower Compact, which went forward to form the American sort of Bill of Rights, I think it was called. But they took that as one lump and put it in. So these descendants have got a lot of roots in the history of America.
And there is kind of a family tree information board just behind you, David. I can see some quite famous names upon that board.
Yeah, there's lots of well-known names, sort of Clint Eastwood, Bing Crosby, Dick Van Dyke, George H.W. Bush, and then Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it goes on and on and on. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the COVID, we were going to celebrate Mayflower 400, and we were expecting lots of American guests to come. But unfortunately, that never happened. Essex County Council, Tendring District Council have really done the town proud. They've invested a lot of money in the Mayflower project. You can walk round the town on a Mayflower trail. There's Christopher Jones' house, which still stands in King's Head Street. So you can wander through these little narrow streets and explore the roots of the Mayflower.
It's not just the Mayflower exhibit here in the Harwich Museum. What other delights can people expect to see?
Everything is on Harwich, all the villages outside, no further. Our Harwich history can go back over 1,000 years. To the early days, for instance, when King Alfred sent his navy into a place called Stourmouth. Harwich really didn't exist then because the Vikings were constantly going up to Ipswich and raiding the town, and the King Alfred's navy met the Danes in Harwich Harbour, or Stourmouth as it was called, and he sunk all the Danish ships. And their little place opposite is called Shotley, and we think this battle is called Bloody Point of 885, and it's still known as Bloody Point on the maps and charts of today.
It is amazing how that history survives in plain sight in somewhere like this, in Harwich on the Essex coast, and it is so varied. We've got sort of the modern parts of the coast that we enjoy around Essex, but then there is such historical parts like Harwich that almost, to coin a phrase that time has forgot would be wrong, because time hasn't forgotten Harwich.
It's still here.
But it's still here.
Yeah, it's always been an important town. It's always been at the defence of this country. We can go back to very early times. And in the early 1300s, Harwich was actually a walled town with the various gates through it, including the water gate, and the north side was actually protected by ditches. And then we can go into the sailing ship era, and then as the Victorian period came in, it became a railway town and a shipping town, and it's always been a connection with Europe here on the ships.
Yeah, and that connection continues to this day. David, we're in this museum, which is fantastic. I hope to be able to explore it more in just a moment. But where is the museum situated? When can people come and visit? How much is it to get in?
One of the highest landmarks in the town is the High Lighthouse, which is 90 feet high. It's quite prominent. So if you can find the lighthouse, we are right next to it. We are opposite the train station and have a bus stop outside, and the museum has its own car park. The entrance fees to the museum, we like to keep it as cheap as we possibly can. It's £3.50 for a day visit. Children under 16 go for nothing. You can buy a longer ticket. Most local people do, because they just drop in here just to go to the coffee shop. You never know what's going to be on our television in the shop. So, yeah, it's a place to come.
I've already eyed up the coffee shop, certainly. David, thank you ever so much. One other thing I haven't mentioned, of course, that as part of the exhibition about the Mayflower, you have a couple of sort of painted pictures, but these come alive, don't they?
They certainly do. In this modern day and age, we have these apps on our phone. And if you download the app when you come into the museum, there are instructions on the wall how to do it. The app is absolutely free. And then you point it at a portrait, and the portrait actually speaks to you. And there's 4 different points that you can go, and then you can hear the people talking to you and their experiences, and some quite prominent people as well.
It is almost magical. David, thank you ever so much for explaining it. I mean, we could talk all day about the history of the Mayflower. It's so rich, but a potted history of what the Mayflower was and what it's done for the world, and particularly here in Harwich and its connections to the town. Thank you ever so much for joining me.
You're welcome.
Don't forget, you can follow Essex by the Sea on social media. It's on Facebook, we're on Twitter and Instagram. So go follow us on whatever device you use. Until next time, thanks ever so much for listening.